All right, thank you all for coming. I'd like to call the Finance, Ways and Means Appropriations Subcommittee to order for March 13th, 2023. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Representatives Barrett, Baum, Boyd, Freeman, Hazelwood, Hicks, Kiesling, Lynn, Miller, Sparks, Zachary, Chairman Williams.
Thank you. Before we get started, do any of the members have any personal orders? Seeing none, we're going to get started. I appreciate everyone's patience being here. We do have a couple members that are straggling in based upon the need for infrastructure improvements in the state of Tennessee, I think of which we're trying to fix this year. So wanted to kind of give you the purpose of the meeting today. Today is an opportunity to talk to UT, THEC, and ETSU, both representing our four-year institutions. And so if you guys will come on up, I'll go ahead and make introductions. And then once we get started, the idea would be that each entity would share their comments for about 10 or 15 minutes. And then we're going to have an opportunity for the members to ask questions as it relates to the subject matter of interest today. And so, we're going to go out of order a little bit, which is what's great about this process. And so we're going to go out of session and hear from them. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Nolan, president of one of our LGIs at ETSU. He's going to go first. And then Interim Director Smith from THEC and Lou Hanman are going to go second. And then Randy Boyd with UT is going to follow up third. And then we'll have some questions following. So, gentlemen, appreciate you guys coming today. If you will, to get started, go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll go in order after that. Thank you very much.
Randy Boyd, President of the University of Tennessee System.
Bob Smith, the Interim Executive Director of the Tennessee Higher Education Commission.
Lou Hanneman, Tennessee Higher Education Commission.
And Brian Nolan, President, East Tennessee State University.
Thank you very much. Dr. Nolan, would you like to proceed?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you and good afternoon. On behalf of the locally governed institutions, it's a pleasure to be with you today as we walk through a broad range of issues related to higher education, both in the state of Tennessee, as well as a setting nationally. Just as a point of contact, I've had the honor to serve as the president of ETSU for a little bit more than a decade. When I was hired, we were governed by the Tennessee Board of Regents, and then through the Focus Act, transitioned to an independent governing board. Prior to that, I served as chancellor of the higher education system in West Virginia, and then I also spent about 8 years on the staff of THEC here in a variety of roles. And what I'd like to do this afternoon is set my comments within a series of frames. The first frame is historical, walking through the history of governance as well as the history of governance generally across the country. Talk some about roles and responsibilities and scope, talk a little bit about THEC, but then finally talk some about questions that we should consider as we move through conversations and deliberations related to structure. But from a historic perspective, states have turned to governing and coordinating boards to balance the tension between institutional and statewide educational priorities. And these bodies really trace their roots to the end of World War II. As our servicemen were returning and the GI Bill was moving into implementation, there was a rush to enroll in higher education across the country, and states created these entities to buffer the pressures between the need for institutional growth, infrastructure, as well as statewide priorities. These entities served a nonpartisan role in refereeing the tug of war for resources. They provided planning, purpose, and priority. And that foundation is similar to the foundation here. THEC was created in 1967 to balance and buffer the demands of institutions against state priorities. The Board of Regents was created in 1972, and we saw the integration of the technical community colleges and the TTCs up under the board in the early 80s. But since its founding in 1967, THEC has played a significant role in defining our state's priorities for higher education. Now, while no two state coordinating bodies are the same, they fall into some general categorizations, and we've provided some background information for you if you want something to read tonight right before you go to bed. But the broad models are as follows. The first is an administrative agency model. This model provides the greatest level of institutional autonomy, and they have limited regulatory authorities. In essence, they provide planning and coordination without the real authority to compel institutions to follow suit. The second are coordinating boards, which is what we have here in Tennessee. It's a quasi-centralized structure in which the statewide board serves in a review and a recommendation capacity in areas such as programs, budgets, et cetera. The next is a regulatory coordinating board, a combination of coordination and governance. This is the board that I worked for in West Virginia that had the ability to review presidential contracts, approve presidential contracts, issue debt, as well as approve academic programs, capital construction, et cetera. And then there's consolidated governing boards, such as what they have in Wisconsin, what we have with the Board of Regents, in which you have a centralized structure in which a statewide board serves in a regulatory capacity over issues ranging from tenure and promotion to the determination and allocation of state budgets. So these bodies exist in all states, but no two bodies are the same. But all of them buffer essentially the teeter-totter between autonomy and accountability. And that notion of autonomy and accountability lies at the core of all issues related to higher education governance. And over the past several decades, we in Tennessee have attempted to address that tension by developing broad public agendas that link higher education to statewide goals, such as increasing educational attainment, improving quality of life, facilitating competitiveness. And innovative states such as Tennessee have linked those goals to their funding mechanisms, things that we did with the Complete College Tennessee Act. But this examination of autonomy versus accountability is something that periodically is reviewed by states, and it periodically has been reviewed by the state of Tennessee. From 1997 to 99, a group of elected business and higher education leaders studied the nature, purpose, and function of the goals of our state's higher education system. This group, the Governor's Blue Ribbon Commission on Higher Education, and I've dusted off this old report from 99, made the following observations and recommendations: that Tennessee needed to define and adopt a modern system-wide mission for its institutions. We needed to elevate educational attainment levels and enhance job training. We needed to create nationally recognized public institutions, particularly at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. We needed to enhance research and innovation. We needed to align missions with purpose. We needed to enhance public service. And we needed to strengthen governance and accountability across systems. And finally, we needed to make investments in financial aid. From that report came elements such as the lottery scholarship program and many of the policy reforms that moved through the state in the early 2000s. But then in 2010, the state embarked upon a series of defining actions that positioned Tennessee as a national leader in the area of post-secondary policy. The Drive to 55 initiative set clear and concise goals for higher education and called on institutions to enhance transfer pathways, to put 120-hour limits on degrees. We implemented the outcomes-based formula. Programs such as Tennessee Sales, the enhancements of the TCATs, Promise and Reconnect emerged from this work. But in essence, our goal was for 55% of Tennesseans to have some form of post-secondary degree or credential. That goal matures in 2025, so it's natural and appropriate that we have conversations around goals as we approach that maturation date. And then, as you all are familiar with, because many of you were involved, in the middle of the last decade, we passed the Focus Act, which led to the creation of independent boards for the regional institutions. But now, in a post-focus landscape, and as we emerge from the pandemic, it's fitting that we reflect upon the impact of these changes on our higher education landscape. Now, if we're going to do so, I think there's a couple of clear questions that have come to my mind. The first is to focus on the ends, not the means. Any conversations we have need to be framed around demographic, economic, and education trends. Second, we need to be specific about the problems that are the catalyst for these discussions. Whatever the issue, we need to address that issue and see how it impacts structure. We also need to look at short-term and long-term benefits of these conversations. We're just now getting our sea legs with the implementation of Focus. And I think some of the elements we're working through is how does the distribution of autonomy and accountability balance itself after the implementation of Focus and as we come out of the pandemic. But as we look at the work that THEC has done, I think one of the things we need to recognize is that for the better part of the past decade, this is a state that has been the national leader for innovation and public policy. And much of that work has been driven by the Commission in conjunction with the institutions. And I wanted to take just a couple minutes, and I know I'm going long, I apologize, I'll speed this up, but just to frame some of the policy buckets that organizations such as THEC are engaged in. First is planning. So irrespective of the state, coordinating boards are involved in planning. They develop and approve statewide master plans. They approve institutional missions. Here in Tennessee, they've structured the development of the Drive to 55 initiative and then collected data and been the reporting and accountability mechanism for the institution. They've developed a framework for capital projects. That framework has changed. I think discussion needs to be had around that process. But irrespective, they and other bodies such as them set the ground rules for the implementation of capital across the state. They develop and implement our outcomes formula. They submit an integrated appropriation request to you and the governor. They oversee our performance funding program on the academic side, and they now, as a result of focus, approve tuition and fee increases. From an academic perspective, they approve and coordinate new academic programs and degree locations. They review academic program production, placement rates, and quality assurance programs. They facilitate collaboration among the institution, and they play a compliance and certification role for for-profits as well as veterans benefits. In the financial aid area, they administer the state's broad-based need, merit, and other financial aid programs, and they administer a lot of outreach programs like Gear Up that are aimed at meeting the goals of Drive to 55. And then from a technology perspective, they maintain the state's unit record database. We have an extremely robust P20 system that, if properly utilized, really could help address many of the questions we have around what happens to students after they graduate, when they enroll, and when they enter the workforce. So in summary, Tennessee has been recognized for its leadership in higher education policy. Much of this work is driven by the goals and the foundation that this body established with the Drive to 55 initiative. And on behalf of the institutions, I want to thank you for the investments that you've made. I want to thank you for the wise and stable leadership that you've provided. And I'll now turn to my colleague, Dr. Smith, for his comments.
Thank you. Dr. Smith?
Well, thank you, President Nolan. You did a masterful job, as I would have expected, of basically stating the responsibilities that we have. And and I want to go back through those with a little flavor from the THEC standpoint, but I'm certainly not going to dispute any of the primary areas that President Nolan offered. I would say that what I'm drawing from is the Tennessee Code, which has given us the charge as the only agency that serves as the umbrella over post-secondary education, and that we have the designated oversight for those areas. Our view is that these are not duplicated responsibilities. They are deliberately stacked in a way that assures that at the Tennessee Higher Education Commission that we have the responsibility for assuring that the public dollars are well stewarded, that there is accountability, that we look to consumer protection and stewardship of that public dollar. In our original charter, which I read from, is in order to achieve the unity in the program of public higher education, there is created the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. The commission shall establish and ensure that all post-secondary institutions in the state cooperatively provide for an integrated system of post-secondary education. To us, that means that we are, and code supports this, we provide the leadership in setting the state's education policy agenda and serve as the agent for education transformation. Quoting again from the code, the commission shall develop a statewide master plan, which President Nolan referred to increase the educational attainment levels of all Tennesseans through strategic future development of public universities, the community colleges, and the colleges of applied technology. In the implementation of these duties, the Commission, in cooperation with the Commissioners of Finance and Administration, the Comptroller of the Treasury, shall establish uniform standards of accounting, records, and statistical reporting systems, and that these be adhered to by the institutions when preparing submission of their data and of their appropriations. We do this through 5 delegated areas, one of which is program approval, which assures quality and accountability for the use of the public money. The system that we have in place is a rigorous process that requires careful thought and documentation by the institutions before offering their programs. We need that rigor up front because once we give approval, there are very few levers that are used to assure continuing accountability for those programs. This past summer, we revised that entire process with the input from all of our institutions, and those revisions were approved by our commission in November. We've tracked the data that identifies the time periods between every step in that process so that we know where there are hiccups, where there are delays, and where responsibilities lie in the approval of those programs. The second responsibility we have is for capital projects. And much like our attention to the rigor associated with program development, we are consistently pressing for rigor in capital project developments so that we can be assured that once a building comes out of the ground, it's going to stay above ground. And our process goes well into the details that are necessary to assure that kind of accountability. The third responsibility that we have is that we do manage tuition management, and that is a new responsibility that came along with the Focus Act. This authority was added in 2016, and since you've entrusted us with that authority, tuition increases have been held to historically low rates. Our fourth responsibility is, as President Nolan pointed out, was the innovative outcomes-based formula, which is $1.4 billion of the taxpayers' resources. Tennessee Code says that our funding formula model shall further the goals of the statewide master plan by emphasizing outcomes across a range of variables and are consistent with the statewide higher education master plan. Our fifth responsibility is data collection, management, and analysis. We are charged to be the data authority to inform our institutions on workforce needs, economic, educational trends, and credentials. But it isn't just for the institutions. We are also the agency that other agencies turn to with the authority to represent quality data as we make workforce plans. We are the resource that you, the rest of the General Assembly, agencies and task force, and our institutions rely on, including the administration, for comprehensive, objective data and for us to offer data-based insights that help all stakeholders make good decisions. Every day, the good people of THEC come to work in service of those responsibilities and those delegated authorities. And the charges that you've entrusted us with, and we look to our authority for guidance policy to be the best post-secondary system in the country. It's an honor to be here today representing that mission and those expectations, and we look forward to your questions.
Next, President
Yes,
Boyd.
Chairman Williams. So as we were speaking today, I was thinking if this was a ESPN game day show, Dr. Dolan would be our analyst, Dr. Smith would be the play-by-play. I'm going to be the color commentator, and I'm going to be brief. We actually did compare notes a little bit beforehand, and I realized me going third, I would just be duplicating what has already been said. But I agree with my colleagues and around the 5 key areas that THEC has focus on and responsibility for. But one that Dr. Nolan highlighted and Dr. Smith alluded to was the visioning aspect of what THEC does. I just want to speak a moment about that part. In 2010, the Tennessee Higher Education Commission created something called the Outcomes Formula, Performance Funding Formula, under Dr. Rich Rhoda, who's in the room today as our director then. This was a formula which awarded funding to our universities based on performance, about how you were able to retain students and graduate them, which as a businessman coming into THAC in 2013 seemed very obvious. Well, of course you would reward people based on performance. That's not done in higher education. All across the country, when the state of Tennessee came up with this performance funding formula, systems all across the country were amazed that Tennessee was doing this. We were a pioneer in this, and I know in 2013 and 14, states all around the country were constantly calling us, having Russ Deaton, one of our colleagues, go and speak on how we were able to create this innovative way of rewarding higher education institutions based on performance of all things. So again, that wouldn't have happened without the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. In 2013, again, working with Rich Rhoda, we created something called the Drive to 55, an overarching vision for our state. No other organization in the state, except maybe the governor, but at least somebody was going to have to still execute it, would be able to create a vision for the state for all of higher education. Each university, each campus can create their own visions, their own missions, but to create an overarching vision for the state, only the Tennessee Higher Education Commission could do. And it created this vision, this target of taking our post-secondary population from 32% to 55% within just 12 years, from 2013 to 2012. And just to create the vision isn't enough. You had to create a strategy. And again, THAC led the way in creating a 5-point strategy of helping students get ready to go to college, getting them into college, making sure they graduated, making sure adults got back into college, and then making sure it was all aligned with the workplace. And because of THAC's initiatives, we were able to create a whole range of programs. Dr. Nolan mentioned something called SAILS, the Seamless Aligned Integrated Learning Systems, but a way in which we could take students that were unprepared to go to college because they needed remediation in English or math. At that time, 80% of our students needed some remediation in English or math. If you have to take remediation in English or math in community college, you've only got a 5% chance of graduating. The SAILS program dramatically improved it. As I think you're aware, when it came to the second strategy of getting students into college, through THAC, we were able to create a formula to make the first community college system-wide free, not just for a year, but for a lifetime. And that also originated through the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. We created something for our adults to get them back into college, something called Reconnect, which made every adult eligible to go to our technical colleges or community colleges free of charge. Again, a vision from THAC. And then lastly, I'll mention when it came to making sure that we were aligned, we created a College for TN website, which within it has lots of great information, but would actually show students where the jobs are. It's not enough just to go to college and get a degree, but it matters what you get a degree in. So we provided the information for our students to make sure that they knew what to sign up for and where the jobs were. Again, all of this was led by the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. Now we have the Momentum Year, which was initiated last year to try to get our college going rate up from a significant drop down to 53% this year to 60% by the fall of 2023. Again, each of our universities could create their own initiatives, but nobody could create an initiative to help embrace everybody in higher education and rally us to a cause for the greater good of the state than the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. So I agree with all the technical things that we do, from collecting data, approving programs, et cetera. But I think one of the big things that THAC is charged with is this visioning part, and something that I'm really proud of the work that they've done in that area. And with that, I'll end my color commentary and turn it over to you for any questions.
Thank you. If you want to leave your bracket for us to review at the end of the hearing, we'd be happy to take it. But
Tennessee's winning all the way.
Yes, I figure, as you should say, sir. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming. It's a really important discussion. I do think we are going to have some questions. I'm going to start with questions, but I want to thank you for coming. I think one of the interesting parts is I look at what we're doing as it relates to this space. Obviously, I have an LGI in my community. I have TCAT 15 minutes away. The impact that you make on our local communities, just from a jobs-related standpoint, is huge. But what you're doing and changing really the outlook and the future of Tennesseans is great. I do think there is great value to THAC and the overreaching umbrella of services that you help provide and push down through the institutions. I think that's really good. But much like we, whether it was the Complete College Act or Outcomes-Based Formulary or Focus Act or any of the changes that we've made over the last 15 or 20 years, the goal really is to say, okay, well, is there a better way? Is there something that we can improve? And so the purpose of the hearing really is just to have a discussion about what it is we're currently doing, what improvements there might be out there that we could make ourselves better and continue to be that leading state as it relates to higher education and delivery of it for our students, because the workforce has changed dramatically, and particularly in our 1 and 2 year institutions and the 4-year institutions since I've come to the legislature. And so thank you for your hard work. I do want to start with the Complete College Act and the outcomes-based formula. I have a couple questions surrounding it. I guess the first would be for you, Director, is has there been many changes as it relates to the formulary from an individual perspective? I know this formulary was originally created because we wanted to change the outcomes and incentivize those. I'm a commission-only sales guy, so I get it. It's all about that. So have there been many changes as it relates to that formulary since it originally started? Just introduce yourself.
Well, yes, there have, and there's been specific reasons for those to continue to drive those economic forces within Tennessee. With your permission, I'd like to call on Dr. Stephen Gentile, who manages that program, to give you an overview of those kinds of changes and how those get implemented.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir. Just introduce yourself for the committee. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Gentile, Chief Policy Officer at the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. As stated earlier, we implemented the outcomes-based funding formula about 12 years ago, in 2011 being its first operation. And we visit it every year, but every 5 years do a substantial review and make changes therein. And the last time we did this was actually this past year in 2022, started at the beginning of the pandemic, put it on pause, and revisited back in 2022. In general, what has stayed the same throughout those 12 years is a recognition of state priorities and institution priorities with all the different outcomes that we produce on our institutions. So what you'll see in 2011, you'll see today, associate degrees, bachelor degrees, progression towards those certificates, workforce training as being mainstays in that formula. The most substantial changes that we've had over the last 12 years, back in 2015, a better recognition of the students who are served by community college sector. So a recognition not just of receiving and progressing low-income and adult students in the formula, they receive extra premium in the formula, but also those students who enter a community college sector unprepared for college and their progression towards a degree. That was a substantial change back in 2015. A big change back in 2022 was also rewarding institutions for putting students and completing students in majors that were in high need fields in the state and across the state for all of our institutions. Those have been the most substantial changes over that time.
Just as a follow-up, since you're sitting there, so do you think, based upon your view of the last several years, outcome-based formula, is it really seen by THEC and by LGIs or UT or TBR? Is it seen as a supplement or a bonus, if you will, or is this regular operations? Generally speaking, I would say that if you're going to create a formulary that you're going to reward those who are doing a great job, then it seems to me like it would be more by nature, by definition, it's an outcomes-based formula, or is it more become an actual cash flow issue or a portion of the balance sheet?
Sir, I will address the questions, I think, what you're asking, and then come back and make sure I have gotten to it. First of all, it's not seen as a bonus in the appropriation. 100% of all appropriations for our institutions, so $1.4 billion of their operating appropriations, are completely up for grabs every year based on performance. So from our fiscal policy perspective, our conversations with our institutions start and end with performance-based funding. Just over this past weekend, the CFO of Dyersburg State Community College asked in the weed questions about, well, how much is one extra hour of contact hours for workforce training worth in the formula, as they said about planning their operations on the campus. So it very much affects the operations of our campus, and they engage with us all the time on that. And it's also, we see as our duty to travel across the state and inform all stakeholders about the funding formula so that they can respond to it in the right way. Sir, did I answer your question?
Yeah, yes, sir, I did. You did. As a follow-up to the presidents, I thought I'd ask them this question. Do you see from a cash flow perspective or from your own operations, do you see if the legislature, when we first came here, one of the biggest questions they asked me was, are you going to fully fund the outcomes-based formula? Because there were years which we didn't fully fund it. The last several years, we have fully funded it. How dependent are your institutions on it being fully funded? If we had a downturn like we did in 13 and we had to, collections were under, how would you go about delivering services through your institutions?
I'll speak first and say for the University of Tennessee, the outcomes-based formula is incredibly important to our cash flow. That's how we look to increase or to support our operating budget each year. If we didn't have any increase, which happened, I think the last time was in 2013, because I remember being with the governor when he was telling everyone that they weren't getting any increases. And it's kind of like saying, okay, if you achieve all these different metrics, you get this reward, and then saying, no, I'm sorry, you don't. But now looking at it from this side, we count on it for our increases in our operating costs. There's been occasion when some of our campuses haven't earned the any additional formula or funding, and it's very, very difficult for them. Their only other option is either cut costs or raise tuition. So if we don't get the extra operating the funds from the performance funding, it's a challenge for us. If I could, just before I turn it over to Dr. Nolan, because I think he would also agree with me on this, one of the areas that we believe that does need to be addressed is some type of formula for our graduate programs. So I think every undergraduate campus across the state would be fully supportive of everything that we do with the performance funding formula, and always appreciate that getting funded. But our graduate programs at the College of Veterinary Medicine, at the Quillen College of Public Health, at the UT Health Science Center, there's not a formula. So we seem to lurch from crisis to crisis. We will not get funding for 3 or 4 years and then have to have a significant increase to help catch it up. It's difficult to come up with a formula for our graduate programs, but we need to have something for them so we're not having this episodic request for increases as we do now.
And if I could follow up on President Boyd's point, first about the non-formula units, and then I'll address your question on the formula units. From the non-formula side, at our institution, that's the Quillen College of Medicine and our family practice entities. Essentially, the appropriations that are provided theoretically cover inflationary costs and then salary, but there's not a metric through which they are able to compete for new resources in a way that the formula units are. We've attempted to address this historically in the state on a number of occasions, but we've yet to be able to fully wrap our arms around it. But I do agree with the President. This is an area that I think is ripe for exploration. On the formula side, depending upon the university, between 35 and 40 cents on the dollar of what it takes to run an institution comes from the state. The rest is tuition or non-state resources. So we are dependent on that state cash flow to help institutional cash flow. But to give you an example of what we've done at our institution to align with the goals of the formula, in the middle of the last decade, we restructured the way we distribute resources internally, moving to a decentralized budget model that placed incentives at the college level to increase retention rates, graduation rates, and the same throughputs that are in the state formula. So I think one of the things that quite often gets lost in the funding discussion is the importance of ensuring that institutions are exploring how they internally allocate resources, and does that internal allocation and generation align with the state's goals? In our case, the answer is yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
let me add one dimension to this, because totally agree, and actually we support the non-formula units having some measure here. Here's why I think this is important. This is an incentive-based program that when people respond, it is a direct, observable, definable return on the state's investment. So we can show you exactly how the institutions have responded to the statewide master plan for higher education and delivered on the objectives that are set by the state. So you have a rare situation where a budgetary allocation has a demonstrable ROI.
Okay. Thank you very much. Next on my list, I've got a list of questioners. If you want to be added to the list, let me know. Next on the list, I have Representative Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start with recognizing Dixon County native and friend of mine since we were teenagers, Mr. Cavender. Good to see you. I'm sure you guys are glad to have him with you here today as well. I hope we can get him up here and start grilling him a little bit. So I want to ask some questions about the capital process for capital projects. Can you describe the process by which institutions prepare and submit these capital projects for approval? Or is there a process?
Oh, there's a rigorous process. That process is similar to the way in which the program approval process goes. And that is, it's based upon criteria that each of the projects must satisfy. And those criteria are then scored by independent readers to determine the overall quality of the project itself and its suitability to the state goals, to the institutional goals, and how it also meets the academic goals within the institution in and of itself. Then from that process is created a list, the final list of projects that THEC fundamentally, through the rigor of this process, certifies are ready to be built. And that you can have, and particularly for the State Building Commission, you can have confidence that there is a need for these projects, that there is a demand for the projects, and that they are well developed, including their own internal business plan. Then that list is forwarded to the administration for consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't want to speak out of order there. I don't want to give you an opportunity to get on to me here. And Mr. Chairman, you kind of covered this already, but just a follow-up question. I don't want to get too far off in the weeds about details on this process, and this may not be the right time and place for that anyway, but as far as the evaluation or how you evaluate the projects and how you score the applications for the different projects, is there a rubric or something that you use, or can you kind of give us just an overview as to how that might work? There we go.
This rubric is divided into 4 areas, and then there are subdivisions to that, and it's based upon 100 points. And you said not to get into the weeds, and it's going to be dangerously difficult to avoid that. But one of the categories is for how well does it satisfy state goals, economic and workforce development, the institutional mission and plan, academic programs, and enrollment data. That is, are there going to be students coming in the pipeline that are going to be occupying this building? We have confidence for that to the future. Second category is how well does it match the campus master plan and the institution's strategic plan. And then there are a whole set of financial characteristics that are important that include the project's objectives and scope, a historical profile, information that is required by F&A for the development of projects. And then the fourth category is space needs. And all of these are defined and then broken into subcategories for scoring. And so following this rubric, this last year we had 9 people who independently read every single one of those projects, scored that, then came together with final scores, and that's what developed the final list. What I think we've all agreed on as we examine this year is we ought to tell that story better. We ought to be, and we're rightfully proud, but we have been ridiculously humble in not making these kinds of characteristics much more obvious. And we're working with, in fact, these are two of the leaders of this effort to make that far, far more transparent so that you can see, as well as the administration can see, how these projects, why these projects are on the list. It's kind of the bottom line.
Final question. I didn't realize how fast an hour goes. I've got a bunch of people on the list, so just one more question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I agree with you. It would be great for you all to kind of do a better job of explaining this and putting it out there so that everybody understands that there is a real process behind how we're spending this money, that we're not throwing darts on the wall. So final question, is there a limit in each fiscal cycle for each institution as to how many requests they can make, or what are the rules in place on that?
Thank you, Representative Barrett. Lou Hanneman with the Higher Education Commission. We do have a limit. So the way it's structured right now, and this largely stems from, we had a stakeholder group that kind of put this process together back in 2016. Currently, the University of Tennessee system can submit 3 projects. Tennessee Board of Regents system can submit 3 projects, and the locally governed institutions can each submit their one priority project. And so those 12 projects in any given year, although it's usually 12, are the ones for consideration. And again, that's been for the last 5 or 6 years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just to follow up to that real quick, how many, you said how many that each institution can submit. I guess the question would be, can that be problematic if you have one institution who seems to be growing? Have you seen that as a problem at all, or one group?
Well, I think, again, it depends on, if you're within the University of Tennessee system, obviously they have a little bit more latitude to put more than one project towards a particular institution to address that kind of growth need. We have not really seen that. I mean, they've been pretty, diverse in kind of which institutions are asking for which project. And across the Board of Regents, similar thing, although, with 40 institutions, they also kind of have a lot of different areas to address. I think in any given year, institutions are being incredibly thoughtful about what are their specific priorities for a state-funded project. Right. And so this is the list each year kind of, I think, represents that.
Thank you. If you could distribute to the Chair Lady Hazelwood, so she can distribute to the team a copy of the rubric, that would be great for us to have. That's something we haven't seen before. If you could do that, that'd be great. Chairman Baum.
Thank you, Chairman Williams. Thank you all for being here and for your comments. I'm in touch with several universities on a regular basis, and I can tell you that I've heard good things about the outcomes funding formula. In fact, I was serving as chair of the Economics and Finance Department at Middle Tennessee State University when it came out, and I can tell you it shifted our focus. People do respond to incentives. I've got a couple of questions about the building process. Once a capital structure has been approved in the governor's budget, I guess this is for Director Smith, how long does it typically take THEC and the State Building Commission to approve the final plan after funding?
Well, go ahead.
No time.
Yeah.
From the Higher Education Commission's perspective, the end of our involvement in either prioritizing or kind of laying out the state's investments or capital investment priorities ends when we transmit the capital outlay list from THEC over to F&A for initial consideration in the governor's proposed budget. At that point, the conversation becomes one between the administration and the legislature, and once that final appropriations bill is approved, the relationship then shifts away from THEC to the institutions dealing specific or directly with the State Building Commission.
Okay, and I guess in that process, can you tell us a little bit about the balance you try and strike between approving broad projects conceptually, like maybe a building that's going to be a science building, versus trying to manage or approve details of these projects, like how the seats for the students in the classroom are going to be arranged, or what kind of technology is going to be in the various classrooms. I mean, broad management and approval versus micromanaging details.
Thank you for that question, and that's a really good question. If you think back, not that long ago, and you were at MTSU, and the long heralded science building was really the tipping point. For those of you who remember, we used to have a list process where the Board of Regents, back when the locally governed institutions were there, and then you had the University of Tennessee system, and each system kind of put up their list of projects that they wanted, and it didn't matter where they were in the development, they just kind of got blended together. And so you could have back of the napkin, kind of projects coming forward, and would just work their way through, and you really weren't necessary to be fully fleshed out projects until you got near the top. The way we do this now, truly you have to bring a project ready to go. And part of THEC's role in the space of the physical footprint for the state is managing the space use and the guidelines that help to inform how that space is used, whether it's office space, classroom space, lab space, goes into informing how these capital projects are designed and conceived of on the front end. And keeping a balance between those different types of space usage across the entirety of higher education, not just within each institution, is why those projects now have such a requirement for the minute. And so you have to, like a project will need to come with an architectural program that kind of lays out each classroom space, but that also goes into making sure that the institution has a business model that will help see that building all the way through to completion.
Okay, maybe I should ask the university presidents if they've got any firsthand experiences or feedback on this.
Well, first, I'd like to start by thanking this body for the investments that you've made in capital. I referenced this Blue Ribbon report from the 1990s, and one of the goals at that point was to have a sustainable flow of resources to support capital, and we were looking at $1 billion aspirationally. That's where we've been each of the past few years. So for that, thank you. I think from an institutional perspective, if there's one thing that we seek in the capital process, it's predictability. If we're going to build a building, many of those require fundraising. If we're going to construct a facility, there's the ripple effects on campus of moves if you're renovating a building and taking a building to the ground. And the way the process works in its current form, you could have a project that you submit one year that's scored at level A, the next year it's scored at level B, the next year it's not on the list at all, and then the next year it gets funded. So if you're working with donors to raise resources for that project, predictability is something that institutions seek. And my comment isn't critical of the commission or staff and the way this works. It's just the way the process unfolds, because each year priorities change. Some years there's a priority on deferred maintenance. The next year the priority may be different. So from an institutional perspective, just predictability and the ability to know where you sequence, because sometimes the desire to raise funds is a multi-year effort. And it is something that in our budget hearings, the LGIs, we've talked about for a number of years, is the need for predictability in the process.
Excellent.
If I could comment on this subject, if I could, and maybe to come back to a question that was asked earlier with regards to some of the rankings and how we choose projects. So maybe I'll share a challenge that just the University of Tennessee has. So I'm going to be speaking in our own self-interest, and then maybe suggest one potential path forward that THEC and some of the LGIs and I have had the conversation around. Just speaking on our interests, since the Focus Act, the capital process hasn't worked in our favor. Prior to the Focus Act, roughly 40% of the pool of capital projects came to the University of Tennessee. Since the Focus Act, only about 21% of the projects have been coming to the University of Tennessee. And as Lou had mentioned, to now, UT gets 3 projects, each LGI gets 1 project. Well, we have 5 campuses, so each year that means 2 of our campuses don't get a project. But if you break it down by square foot, the University of Tennessee has 30 million square feet. We're 229 years old. 60 of our buildings are over 100 years old. We have 30 million square feet. The LGI is 26.6, and the TCAT's 2.6. I'm not I'm just sharing that to sheriff that with the allocation of 3 to 6, it's the ratio hasn't worked in our favor. Since the Focus Act, we've been getting roughly $80 million per year in projects versus LGI's of a total of $200 million per year. I share all that to say maybe there is a time to look at ways of doing things differently. One suggestion that we've had a conversation around is being even more transparent and creating a matrix which shows all the criteria that we've talked about, ranking all the projects on or listing all the projects and how much donations they've gotten, how much they're aligned to the workforce, et cetera. And I'm not prescribing the matrix, but having something that's open and transparent that shows all the projects. And at the end of the day, it's your choice and the governor's choice to decide what the priority is. So rather than having a list in which you're trying to figure out how the list was created, having all the information, and then based on the priorities of the state at that time, maybe one year we're strapped for funding. And so we say, well, we're going to pick the projects that have lots of match. Maybe another year it's about workforce. We've got to be able to get buildings built that are going to align to the workforce. But it's really, at the end of the day, it's your decision, the governor's decision, and what we need to work toward is giving you the kind of information that you need to be able to make the best decisions possible for the state.
Thank you. Chair Lady Hazelwood, I think you had a follow-up.
I do. It's in this general area. You know, one of the big concerns that we have on this committee is, while I think it's been alluded to, we have the past couple of years particularly, there's been a lot of money allotted to capital projects for higher ed. There's also been a huge cost overrun on those projects, more than we've seen in, other areas. I know inflation, there, obviously with COVID and supply chain issues, all of the things that were, couldn't have been foreseen, particularly a couple of years ago. But I'm just concerned about our estimating process, who's looking over that, and what the plan is. Right now, we have a lot of state money, but there are also a lot of folks asking for those dollars. We have more ask always than fulfillment resources. So I guess my question is, on these capital projects that have already been funded, what is the plan if the state cannot come up with all the additional money that is on the shortfall? Then are the universities able to go back to donors? Are we going to have to cut back on the projects? How are we going to deal with the issue of the, I guess, underpricing of what we've already supposedly approved and what I think the legislature would have expected to be underway?
I think the answer is a little bit of both. If there's a project that's funded at $50 million by the state, and as it comes ready to move to implementation, cost overruns take that to 60, then as an institution, the approach we've taken is we either have to fundraise or adjust the scope. For our projects that we've submitted, the Brown Hall renovation, which is a renovation of our science building, when we submitted the materials, we incorporated a 12% estimated inflation. We've gone back and adjusted, and we think that's about 14%, so there's a gap, and we'll either have to address that gap through reduction in scope or fundraising on behalf of the university.
And I'll say, if I could echo what Dr. Nolan just said, for the University of Tennessee, we're either going to raise additional donors funds or use institutional funds to make up the difference. And also mention in the new State Building Commission Modernization Act, it's going to allow us to be able to get better estimates earlier, which is really important. Unfortunately, we have to come to you with a request oftentimes before we've engaged with any architects. And so we're making estimates without as much knowledge as we should have. So I think with this new bill, this will allow us to get better estimates to you earlier.
And that's a subject for a whole nother day as we're out of time. But I think a lot of us on this committee are very committed to try and look at that process, as are both speakers. It just takes too long from inception to ribbon cutting, and we've got to figure out a way to, and every delay adds inflationary cost and unforeseen circumstances and all of those things. So we look forward to working with you to see if we can determine some ways to cut that time and, get these buildings on campus up and running a lot quicker than the 10 years or more that it seems to take now. So thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Great point from the chair lady. I do think we're spending a lot of money in transportation space this year to try to shrink the window of time it takes for approval and construction and delivery of roads. I think in the case of our institutions of higher learning, the quicker we can deliver projects, I think the better, mainly because of the cost overruns that we've seen over the last 3 years, but also because it means we're able to deliver those degrees to those students and get them in the workforce faster as well. So, Chairman Zachary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we've only got a couple of minutes. I'll be brief. Just, gentlemen, thank you for your representation. You guys are fantastic spokesmen for higher ed in our state. So thank you for being here in the presentation. Very, very good. Just quickly, as you both know, I'm carrying the Higher Ed Modernization Act for Speaker Sexton, and that's kind of in the same vein that we're talking about here. This is related to private funds. But the process now, just to be really transparent, is just bureaucratic, it's archaic, and it is not conducive to be able to take a project from when the private funds are in hand, funded by either private donors or an auxiliary project, taking those funds and quickly starting a project, and it leads to many of the things we're talking about here, project overruns and other things. Can you speak to briefly the impact, this is already passed out of subs into full, could you both just quickly speak to the impact passing that legislation will have directly related to the private funded projects and what that does for our institutions?
I'll just say that my chancellor at UT Knoxville said if we can get this done, that she thinks it's the most important thing that I'll have done in my entire tenure at the University of Tennessee. It's critically important to all of our universities to be able to respond to our community's needs, being able to build buildings faster and cheaper. And speed is money now. If it takes an extra year on a $100 million building, we just added an extra $20 million to the cost. So it helps us save money. It helps us respond quicker to the market. And it's important for us competitively to be able to do this.
And I also feel it helps with transparency. There are a number of projects, if they're auxiliary in nature and we're working with the donor, we may or may not be able to formalize that relationship, but we have to disclose it anyway. So when you see a disclosed project list, there are some projects on that list that are aspirational because of the process, your term bureaucratic. So if we did have the flexibility, independent of the current structure, to move auxiliary projects forward, residence halls in particular, we could get those residence halls up and out of the ground faster and at a lower cost because those are institutionally funded, and that lowers the cost for our students.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. It's unfortunate here. I have a huge list of people to ask questions, which means it's very necessary for us to have this hearing today. The big challenge is I'm out of time. Several of us have to be in pensions and insurance, but of the questions, if the members want to submit their questions to my office and Chair Lady Hazelwood's office, we'll be happy to distribute those to you as well. There are things that I hoped we'd talk about today, like TSAC funding, as well as different or new degree deliveries. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is our workforce is dramatically changing. Our unemployment rate is extremely low. And we have this workforce that's constantly changing from one year to the next, and being able to provide new certificates or degrees to individuals in our state is really important. And so there's just so many questions that I still have left, but I appreciate your testimony here today. It may be that we call you and say, hey, come back, let's do 2.0 or something, but really appreciate you all being here today. If the members, without objection, I'm going to go back into session, which I don't think I actually went out of session. But thank you guys for coming today, and I look forward to getting the answers back from the other questions that we had today. So thank you very much. Do the members have any questions, comments? Seeing none, we will adjourn.